Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
Hmm.
This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're diving into A History of the United States in 5 Crashes. Stock Market Meltdowns That Defined a Nation by Scott Nations. You hear market crashes, and it's easy to think
Right.
dry graphs,
I need to
number.
bring stuff.
But this book is a wild ride through human drama, ambition, and the ripple effects of choices that shook the nation.
What's fascinating is how Nations reveals that these crashes weren't just isolated incidents.
Right.
They're chapters in a much bigger story about risk, innovation, and the constant struggle to regulate these powerful financial forces.
Okay, so first up is 1901, the Northern Securities Corner. Picture this. Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster himself, going head-to-head with J.P. Morgan. Talk about a clash of titans.
I know, right?
What was it about this crash that really sets the stage for the century to come?
It exposed the immense power these massive trusts held.
Yeah.
Northern Securities controlled a huge chunk of the railroad industry. When Roosevelt went after them, it was a battle for the very soul of American capitalism.
Really?
Were we going to let a handful of incredibly wealthy individuals control essential industries, or were we going to fight for a more level playing field?
And it wasn't just about principles, right? This fight nearly took down the entire market. That must have been terrifying for everyday people watching their savings vanish.
Absolutely. May 9th, 1901 became known as Blue Thursday for a reason.
Makes sense.
The market plunged as this battle for control of the Burlington Railroad played out.
Oh, wow.
It showed how quickly personal rivalries and unchecked ambition could have these disastrous, widespread consequences.
It makes you wonder if those involved, like Morgan and the railroad tycoons, James J. Hill and E.H. Harriman, even graphed the potential fallout.
Perhaps not fully.
Okay.
But the 1901 crash exposed another crucial element, the unintended consequences of legal decisions. Just a few years earlier, the Supreme Court's ruling in the E.C. Knight Company case actually made it harder to prosecute monopolies.
Oh, so it backfired.
Ironically, this paved the way for even larger trusts, like Northern Securities, to form.
So a decision meant to regulate business ends up having the opposite effect. That's a pretty clear warning sign for the future, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And those warnings went unheeded, as we see just a few years later in the panic of 1907.
Here's where we see a new breed of financial player emerge. Trust companies. They promised higher interest rates, but were taking on huge risks with little oversight. Haven't we heard this story before?
History often rhymes. In this case, it's the Heinz brothers trying to corner the copper market using their own bank, the Mercantile National.
Oh, wow.
Sound familiar?
It does?
A risky gamble that backfires spectacularly, but this time it triggers a full-blown panic.
And it's Charles Barney and the Knickerbocker Trust Company that really take the hit. The company collapses, and suddenly everyone's scrambling to get their money out of banks. Can you imagine that chaos?
Imagine the lines outside those banks, the fear in the air as people realize the system they trusted is on the verge of collapse. This is where J.P. Morgan, the man who helped create these massive trusts, ends up stepping in again.
Wait, so the guy who benefited from the system's lack of regulation becomes the savior? That's ironic, to say the least. What drove him to do that?
Nations suggest it was a mix of self-preservation and a genuine desire to avert total disaster. Morgan understood that if the financial system went down, he went down with it.
Yeah.
So he used his personal fortune to stabilize the system, effectively becoming the lender of last resort.
That sets a precedent that's going to echo throughout the 20th century, right? The idea of these too-big-to-fail institutions and the government stepping in to bail them out.
Precisely. The panic of 1907 revealed a huge flaw, the lack of a central bank to act as a backstop. It was a wake-up call that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. But as we'll see, even with the Fed in place, crises were far from over. In fact, they were about to get a whole lot bigger.
Speaking of bigger, let's fast forward to 1929 and the crash that still haunts history, Black Tuesday. What strikes you about the lead-up to this crash, knowing what we know about 1901 and 1907?
The Roaring Twenties was a time of incredible optimism and innovation, but it was also a time of excess.
Right.
You have this rise of individual investors pouring into the stock market, fueled by easy credit and speculation. Sound familiar?
Yes.
It's a recipe for disaster that we've seen before.
And it wasn't just everyday folks getting caught up in the frenzy. Nations introduces us to Michael Meehan, this master manipulator of stock prices.
Right.
He wasn't just playing the market, he was rigging it. How did he manage to pull that off?
He orchestrated elaborate stock pools, basically groups of investors who would collude to drive up the price of certain stocks. They'd use the media, spread rumors, even bribe journalists to create this artificial hype. And it worked. They made a fortune.
It sounds like the Wild West of finance, with very few rules and even fewer consequences. So where was the Federal Reserve in all of this?
They were hesitant to intervene, partly because they were still a relatively new institution, and partly because they didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the bubble that was building. They were afraid of spooking the market.
But there's a twist, right? The book talks about Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Fed, who died just before the crash. What if he had lived?
It's one of those tantalizing what-ifs of history. Strong was a powerful figure, and some speculate he might have taken a more proactive approach. But we'll never know for sure.
Right.
What we do know is that the crash of 1929 was a turning point. It exposed the fragility of the system, the dangers of unchecked speculation, and the devastating consequences that could ripple out from Wall Street to Main Street.
And that's where we'll leave it for now. Join us in part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore the crashes of 1987 and 2008 and see how technology adds a whole new layer of complexity and risk to the financial landscape.
So we've seen how those early crashes expose the dangers of unchecked greed and the unintended consequences of financial innovation. But now let's jump ahead to 1987, where technology really enters the picture. It's Black Monday, October 19th.
Right.
A day when the Dow Jones plunges a record 22.6%.
Wow.
What's striking about this one is that a tool designed to reduce risk
Uh-huh.
actually makes things much worse.
You're talking about portfolio insurance, right?
Yeah.
This strategy that sounds so safe,
Yeah.
so sensible, but turns out to be anything but.
Right.
Explain that to me.
Okay.
How does something meant to protect investments end up amplifying a crash?
Imagine you're an investor.
Yeah.
And you want to protect your portfolio from losses. So you buy something called a put option.
Okay.
Which basically gives you the right to sell your stocks at a certain price, even if the market drops below that.
Okay.
Portfolio insurance was supposed to create a similar safety net, but in a more complex, automated way.
Okay. I'm following so far.
Yeah.
But where does it all go wrong?
The problem is that portfolio insurance relied on these sophisticated mathematical models to determine when and how much to sell, to hedge against those potential losses. And when the market started to slide, these models triggered a massive wave of automatic selling, as everyone was trying to protect themselves at the same
It
time.
was like a stampede for the exits. Only it's being driven by algorithms, not human panic.
Exactly. And this was amplified by the rise of computer trading. Algorithms were executing these trades at lightning speed, further accelerating the sell-off.
Wow.
Nations highlights this as a key lesson of Black Monday, the dangers of relying too heavily on complex models and automated systems without fully understanding the potential consequences.
It's a reminder that even in a world of sophisticated technology, human psychology, that herd mentality, still plays a huge role. The book also mentions this guy, Robert Prechter, and his Elliott wave theory. Didn't he predict the crash?
Prechter had gained quite a following for making some accurate market predictions in the early 80s. He was using this form of technical analysis, the Elliott wave theory, which claimed to predict market trends based on recurring wave patterns. And just days before Black Monday, he warned of an impending crash.
So did he actually cause the crash or just get lucky with his prediction?
It's impossible to say for sure, but his warning likely contributed to the anxiety and may have even triggered some early selling.
Interesting.
It's a classic example of how a prediction, even if based on flawed logic, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy when enough people believe it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the market's in free fall. Everyone's panicking.
Yeah.
What stops it from completely imploding?
It was a combination of factors. The Federal Reserve, learning from past mistakes, stepped in quickly to inject liquidity into the system and reassure investors. And thankfully, some level-headed institutional investors saw this as a buying opportunity and helped stabilize prices, but it was a close call. A stark reminder of how fragile the system could be, even with safeguards in place.
Black Monday feels like a turning point, a wake-up call for a new era of finance, where technology plays an ever-increasing role. But it's clear the lessons of the past haven't been fully learned. Let's move on to the final crash covered in the book, the meltdown of 2008. This one's probably still fresh in the minds of many listeners, a crash that seemed to come out of nowhere. What were the warning signs that we missed? And what made this one so different?
The roots of this crisis lay in the subprime mortgage market. Easy credit and lax lending standards created a housing bubble, with banks giving out mortgages to people who couldn't really afford them. These risky mortgages were then bundled into complex securities called mortgage-backed securities and sold to investors around the world.
Does that sound familiar?
It is,
It's
right?
like the trust companies of 1907.
Only
On a much grander scale, right? Packaging up risky bets and selling them off as safe investments. But how do these securities get rated as safe when they were built on such shaky foundations?
That's a key part of the story. The rating agencies, like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, played a significant role. They gave these complex, opaque securities high ratings, essentially giving them a stamp of approval that masked the underlying risk.
So investors are being told these securities are safe, even though they're basically ticking time bombs. And to make things even more complicated, you have these credit default swaps. I remember hearing about those, but can never quite wrap my head around them.
Imagine you're betting on whether a house of cards will collapse. That's essentially what a credit default swap is.
Okay.
It's a bet on whether a particular debt, like a mortgage-backed security, will default. And as the housing bubble started to deflate, these bets went sour, big time.
So the cascade of failures, starting with those risky mortgages.
Yeah.
And spreading throughout the entire financial system, right?
Yeah.
And once again, the government has to step in with massive bailouts. It seems like we keep repeating the same mistakes, only with bigger and more complex instruments.
Nations argues that the 2008 meltdown was a wake-up call, but perhaps not the final one. He highlights the interconnectedness of the global financial system, showing how a problem in the U.S. housing market can quickly spread across the world, impacting economies everywhere. And he emphasizes the role of individual actors, like Angelo Mazzillo, the CEO of Countrywide Financial, who pushed these risky loans, even as he privately acknowledged the dangers.
It's frustrating, isn't it? You have these figures who are profiting from a system they know is flawed, and then when it all comes crashing down, they get bailed out. While everyday people are left to deal with the consequences, it's enough to make you cynical about the whole system.
Cynical, perhaps, but hopefully also more informed. Nation's book isn't just a history lesson. It's a call to action. He urges us to learn from these crashes, to understand the forces at play, and to demand a more resilient and equitable financial system. So we've journeyed through over a century of financial history, exploring those crashes that reshaped America's economic landscape. From the era of robber barons to the age of algorithms, it seems some lessons are hard-learned but easily forgotten.
Yeah, we've seen how greed, fear, and that herd mentality drive these cycles of boom and bust. As much as we'd like to believe technology has made us more rational, Black Monday and the 2008 meltdown show that those human impulses are still very much in play.
Absolutely. Nations argues that understanding this human element is key to understanding these crashes. He brings these stories to life. Through vivid portraits of the individuals involved, figures like Teddy Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan, Michael Meehan, even Angelo Mazzillo in the 2008 crisis.
Right.
These weren't just faceless forces. They were people making decisions, sometimes reckless, sometimes well-intentioned, but always with profound consequences.
So if we're looking for takeaways, for wisdom we can apply to our own financial lives, where do we even begin? After all, most of us aren't battling tycoons or designing complex algorithms.
It starts with recognizing that risk is inherent in any investment. No matter how safe or sophisticated something seems, there's always a chance things could go wrong. So do your research, ask questions, don't just rely on ratings agencies or the advice of others. Understand what you're investing in, and be wary of anything that feels too good to be true.
It's like that old saying, if you don't understand it, don't invest in it. But beyond that personal due diligence, what about the bigger picture? What can we do to prevent these crashes from happening in the first place?
Nations doesn't offer easy answers, but he does emphasize the importance of regulation. While it can't prevent every crisis, effective regulation can help mitigate their severity and protect investors from predatory practices. The challenge, of course, is finding that balance between fostering innovation and preventing reckless behavior.
It's a constant struggle, isn't it? We want markets to be dynamic and innovative, but we also need safeguards to prevent those innovations from spiraling out of control.
Precisely. And that's where informed citizens come in. We need to engage in these debates, to understand the complexities of the financial system, and to demand transparency and accountability from those in power.
A History of the United States in 5 Crashes is a powerful reminder that these events aren't just abstract historical footnotes. They're stories about human choices, about the consequences of those choices, and about our collective responsibility to build a more resilient and equitable financial system. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we highly recommend picking up the book. You can find a link to purchase it in the description below.
And if you're looking for more thought-provoking content that will nourish your mind on the go, be sure to subscribe to Mindful Moments for more deep dives into books that matter. Thanks for joining us.